Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us. My name is Christina Caesar, and I manage marketing and communications at Synergy Technical, and I have the honor of introducing today's speakers and moderating today's session. Today's topic is around Microsoft Entra, the solution that seems to be reshaping the identity and access management landscape. Just a quick reminder, this webinar is being recorded, and please drop any questions or comments within the Q&A function within Teams. And just a little bit about us. Synergy Technical is an IT consulting firm headquartered in Richmond, Virginia. We have clients in over 70 countries in all 50 states and manage over 3 million licenses of Microsoft 365 for our clients through our licensing and managed services practice. A lot of our success has been in no small part due to Microsoft, and in the last few years, our partnership with TSI, Microsoft's Tech for Social Impact team, has helped expand not only our community outreach programs, but our impact on nonprofits around the country, and has helped us further emphasize our company mission of we do good work, which we strive to embody not only in our consulting services, but as people in our community as well. And with that, I'll be brief because I know there's a lot of content to cover today. I would like to introduce Jason Karavitas, a Senior Partner Development Manager on Microsoft's TSI team, to further welcome all you lovely people.
Christina, thank you so much, and welcome everyone to today's session. Equally, I'm going to try and be brief, but did just want to add some additional context to the slide that you're looking at now that I think speaks volumes of Synergy Technical's work, again, around the nonprofit community, and that doesn't just mean deploying services and solutions with Microsoft, but really how they approach that from the core of their mission and values. So something I get to see very clearly every day in working with them. And what makes their partnership with Microsoft rather unique is that in addition to being a partner of Microsoft, of course, they are one of the select few partners that are considered managed with a more direct relationship to the Microsoft Tech for Social Impact community and team. So we have an opportunity to address needs across the board, and certainly what we've seen from Synergy Technical over the past several years in this partnership is their ability to really lean in across a number of different scenarios that do differentiate the nonprofit sector from others. And when we talk about the topic today, on identity and access, that is rather unique because we have, we operate with volunteers and staff and board members and community members and beneficiaries that can really make our roles as nonprofit professionals rather challenging when it comes to making sure that you maintain a secure and productive environment. So really thrilled to be along for the ride today. I'll be in chat to support any questions as well, and I'd encourage anybody in attendance to chime in as well. We've got the team from Synergy Technical on to answer too, but want to go ahead and hand it off to Adrian from the Synergy Technical team, who's going to be leading us through today's session. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Jason. We greatly appreciate your presence, and it's good to catch up with you again today too. So yeah, this discussion is really kind of based on a presentation I got to do a couple months ago at a local conference. It was the RVA Sec 2023 conference, and I got to present about how users have developed over thousands of years a trust in passwords that is very difficult for us and IT to break, right? A lot of times users tend to trust that their password is something that is immutable, and it's very valuable. We keep changing the parameters on what security means, but all the time they still going back to they have to have a password, right? So the name of the talk was I Heart My Password. There's a link to it down here at the bottom if you want to go and watch the video. It's about 50 minutes long, but it really does dive into thousands of years of cultural history around how we protect things by keeping them up in our brain space, and how we as IT people are all a bunch of crazy folk. But that talk itself was born largely of the content of this slide right here. So every year, Microsoft releases a digital defense report, and this data was from the 2022 version. And what it really dug into was this particular slide anyway, dug into the top issues that Microsoft found in dealing with cyber risk engagements. And I thought it was very interesting because the top two things that both pinged at 98%, as in they found this in 98% of organizations that had been breached, were legacy authentication protocols and excessive admin credentials, right? And so that's what sort of started this concept of where where are we finding opportunities to improve our permissions controls? Where is permission creep happening? And you'll notice that if you kind of move down this list a little bit, not too far behind it, behind those poor authentication controls, we also have insecure configurations, right? So a lot of our permissions creep that we've dealt with over the years really boils down to insecure configurations. So we're going to look at how we can manage permissions and manage them better with Microsoft Entra ID. Now, I will caveat and say this is not going to be a full and total exploration of Entra or the Admin Center. We actually did a webinar covering that last year. And again, the link to that video is at the bottom of this screen as well. We did not at the time have access to the internet access or the private access capabilities. So we're going to circle back and do those in the following months. So make sure to come back and check us out as we roll into covering those capabilities. But today we're going to cover 4 critical areas where, in my experience, traditional identity systems like Active Directory make it difficult to control permissions over time. And those are joiner, mover, leaver. There has never actually been a native tool in Active Directory to handle the most basic functions of account management, right? Lifecycle milestones simply are not a thing that Active Directory natively processes. Auditing changes. Net logon is not part of this, but talking about the changes of security configurations is a Herculean feat at its best that expands exponentially with logarithmic growth in Active Directory. So the more domain controllers you have, the harder it is to go find that needle in a haystack because you're checking every single one of them, right? Privileges, once given, are extremely hard to pull back, and we'll cover that in a little bit more detail later on too. And then also, anything that we do has to be scalable and supportable, no matter how well documented it is. It has to be able to survive a 3 o'clock in the morning support call. So let's dig in and talk about what these 4 areas look like traditionally and how they're handled better in Entra ID. So again, joiner, mover, leaver processes in Active Directory, there has never been a native tool to support this function, right? You're either manually creating accounts, or you're cloning accounts, or you have some sort of a bulk import process. Almost every organization that I've ever worked for has moved that into some sort of a PowerShell or VB script query where they're pulling data from some repository, whether it's a form or whatever, and creating that content in Active Directory. There are gaps in this process, though, even when we do this correctly, right? Because Active Directory has no such provisions for anything like a start date or a term date. We can stuff that data in other places, but we tend to find it gets a little bit landlocked when it's time to move it into other systems. So we are stuck not just doing manual creations of accounts, but also manual updating of accounts. And then if we want to start moving into more advanced mechanisms, we end up having to buy a third-party solution anyway, right? Whereas in Entra ID, there is now actually a native provisioning service that's designed to consume content from any source. And then we also now have lifecycle workflows that are designed to align to all of those those employment lifecycle milestones. So Microsoft has supported ingestion of account data from Workday and SuccessFactors for some time through dedicated provisioning configurations. But just last month, they introduced the API-driven provisioning engine that's designed to support HR-driven provisioning from any source. Now, what's different here is that we can now accept data into the provisioning endpoint from any system, apply our schema mappings, our SCIM schema mappings, and then decide how to provision the account in the cloud and or on premises. So this moves us away from having to have pre-formatted and pre-mapped identity data and allows us to take identity data that may include things like start and term dates, transform it to match the systems that we need to support, and then move it into those identity systems. So we can actually now create, onboard and support any identity workforce system out there. So it doesn't have to just be Workday and SuccessFactors anymore. Then we can take that data and push it directly into the new lifecycle workflow experience. Now, if you've seen lifecycle workflows in the Entra portal or previously in the Azure AD portal, these have been around for some time, but they have now actually been moved largely into a new experience, which is Entra ID governance. And what they're going to allow us to do then is take that joiner, mover, leaver experience beyond simply the provisioning of the accounts and actually align it to those milestones and move users forward without having to touch the accounts. So we have templated workflows that begin with these basic 8 functions, right, that align to everything from pre-hire through post-offboarding, along with job moves in the middle and immediate terminations, because unfortunately that is a part of life. But we can take those templates and we can deploy them to any number of groups or any number of actions, right? So here you can see in my organization, I've defined the life cycle for employees of the marketing department. And Christina, I was not thinking about you at the time. I simply needed a department name to use.
Thanks for the disclaimer.
Yeah, no worry. So each of these workflows is based on a triggering event from a connected HR system, right? So start and term dates. And generally, you know, we're going to be applying these things to only things we're only going to be applying these to people that are identified as being in the marketing department. So we're reading the attributes of the accounts that exist to determine which accounts should receive these actions, okay? Now, we can look at the historical versions of all of these particular workflows and see what has changed with them over time too. So we're not just stuck having a whole bunch of things and being stuck with what's out there. All of these workflows and all of the actions of those workflows are pre-filtered to things that would make sense to be a part of that workflow, right? So if we are onboarding a new hire, what are the typical things that may go along with that process, right? It may include adding users to a group, sending them a welcome email. It may include adding licenses, which I'm doing through other group memberships here. It may include adding custom tasks, in which point we can push this off into things like logic apps and have other processes happen outside of this space. But anytime there is a new hire in the marketing department, I, as the admin, don't have to wait to receive the document telling me which groups they're supposed to be a part of, all that kind of fun stuff. It's just baked in. And as the user moves through their employment tenure at Contoso or Syndemo or whatever it happens to be, all of these processes pick up and take off and do what they're expected to do at their expected times. And I don't have to write any VB script or PowerShells to do it. So when it's time to offboard this employee, HR can simply enter the term date in their system. Entra ID provisioning can ingest that and begin the offboarding workflows, and no human has to touch the account, right? So in my example workflows that are here, an account is created for the user 7 days before their start date. A temporary access pass is granted. On the start date, the user is added to all the pertinent groups they need. The account is enabled, and then licensing is added as well, and they're sent a welcome email, right? When the user leaves, the account is automatically disabled, removed from groups and teams, and 7 days later, the license is removed. And 30 days after the termination date, the account is deleted. And at no point did I ever have to touch that account. And this is just for one particular department based on one type of rule filtering on the department field. We can base this on lots and lots and lots of different attributes, and really it can become very flexible. And again, you don't have to babysit this process. This was one of my absolute biggest pet peeves when I worked in organizations that had more than 1,000 users. The attribute maintenance and pulling back licenses and all that stuff just became overwhelming and very, very manual. So the next step in limiting permissions creep, and this is kind of a gap that Active Directory has out of the box as well, is auditing changes, right? So I mentioned that auditing security changes is a Herculean feat that grows exponentially with logarithmic growth in Active Directory. In order for you to get audit logs in the first place in Active Directory, you have to first create an audit GPO, you have to assign it to your domain controller's OU, you have to wait for replication, make a change, and then check every single domain controller's security event logs for one of these 3 entries. And you're not done yet because the event log doesn't tell you what you're looking at until you open the event itself, right? So finding these things, defining how long or how large the log files can be such that they're not impactful to the performance of the domain controller, but they're not so small that they're meaningless, is an art, right? And then also when you have a set of domain controllers that span the globe, and some are 10 years older than others, some have lots of disk space, some don't, it becomes very, very, very challenging to manage audits in Active Directory over time. And frankly, I am deeply impressed by any admin who can actually find what they're looking for when auditing changes through the AD security log in AD. That hats off to you if you're able to do it. In Entra, we just check the audit logs for things like add member to group. And it really is truly that simple. There is a central audit log. There are no versions of it to go search for. By default, it will hold content up to 30 days. If that's not sufficient, we can enable connections to things like Azure Log Analytics to hold that data for as long as we need it to. And then from there, we can push that data into Sentinel, or we can create Azure alert rules so that we can get notified programmatically if there is a change to a monitored security group. So things that were nigh impossible to find in the first place in Active Directory are as simple as a quick search of the audit log and highly extensible in Entra ID. There's no more content to cover on that, right? It's just easy. It's a thing that's very difficult in one, it's very easy in the other. Access control, though, all up as a core function of Active Directory is probably one of my biggest pet peeves, and it has to do with this acronym at the top right or top left here. I would be very curious to know in chat how many people know what that stands for, and if you have encountered an environment where it's configured according to best practices, because it very rarely is. And the other challenge we get into in Active Directory is we can just nest infinitely, right? If we move into the Entra ID side of that thing, of that set of controls and challenges, we have dynamic group membership that can be based off user attributes and access packages that can deliver access to users either programmatically or users can self-service request it. So we're going to dig into this and we're going to talk a little bit about what's going on here. So in traditional Active Directory best practices, right, we had our AGDLP model. Our account belongs to a global group, belongs to domain local groups, belongs to permissions. And yes, the U can be thrown in there to add universal group support, and that just mucks it up even more. But what we would have is a user or a group of users are supposed to be organized by a job role, and that job role is a global group, and that global group is a member of permissions groups that then govern permissions to resources in Active Directory. But while that is all great on paper, and it all looks great, now we have a new user who decides to start, and Bill Jacobs comes in and he is added immediately to the same role group, right? He's got the same job title, but that doesn't matter because this is Active Directory. Now, Bill decides that he can't get access to the file comms share, and it's 3 o'clock in the morning, and he calls the help desk. And they look and they see that sure enough, Bill's not in that group. They're not looking at whether or not it's domain local or global group, but he's not in that group, so they add him to that group. The next day, he says, you know, maybe I really shouldn't have access to modified content in the file share here, right? So maybe I just need write access. I accidentally deleted a file. Okay, I'm going to call the help desk back. Now they're going to create a new group that says write only. Now, some of you already know this means he'll be able to create new files, but he'll never be able to edit them. And that's another problem that we're going to get into. But now they add Bill to this new group, and they go ahead and add that directly to the permissions on the file server, and they remove the modify group because you're right, gosh, maybe people shouldn't have modify access to this. Only now Alan calls in and says, hey, I can't modify this, so they add him directly into the domain local group and also into the right group. So now our permissions have gone all higgledy-piggledy, and all we have had is one user who had a problem late at night, and a help desk agent looked and said, they sure are not in the right group, and they've added them, and our entire permissions model is blown apart, right? And that's one user in one group, and you scale that out over thousands of users, over thousands of groups, and you end up with something that it fails, and the scaling of the failure is exponential, and then you don't review service tickets until a month later, and by that time, I mean, the ship has sailed, right? I've dealt with this in so many organizations, and what begins with a well-documented and beautiful permissioning method ends up 3 years later with just thousands of empty groups, and everyone's terrified to delete any one of them because nobody knows if something is nested through. So we do have groups in Entra, but we also have a lot of different ways to manage access to those groups and what those groups can do. So we can manage access, memberships, licenses, apps, sensitivity, retention, classification, and even roles through groups in Entra ID. But we have some options, right? So we can not just manage through groups, we can also define that we are going to have dynamic groups, right? So users, our membership in our groups is based on some attribute or combination of attributes. And that's whether it's a a job title or a department, or even the presence of a license, or even the existence in yet another group membership, or if any of those things change, even light locations, we can actually have users that are dynamically added to certain groups or removed from certain groups, and their permissions will change along with those changes. And now, because those attributes can be self-service for the user side, if a user moves from, say, Boston to Atlanta and they realize that IT hasn't changed their city, we can give them authority to change that. And now all of a sudden, all of those permissions that should align with the Atlanta access can be made available to that user. I'm not saying that's the way you want to do it. I'm saying that it can be done. Users can become responsible for maintaining their own hygiene, which is pretty cool. It's very difficult to do in Active Directory, but it's super duper easy to do in Entra ID. So there is even a validation tool that will allow you to edit and test the membership against your rules. So in this case, I started with the department equals whatever, or the company name begins with whatever, but I also wanted to run a test to see what if you're also in a place where your zip code matches 23220, which is downtown Richmond, and you're also testing against, you know, your account is enabled. Well, I've set it as an or statement. So now I've got both an external member who's in 23220 and an internal member whose account is enabled and they're a member of the company. So we can set up either ors combinations and do whatever we want to and test and validate before we turn these rules on to make sure that the right users get into these right groups at the right time. But then I can also go further by adding license assignments, right? I did mention this, but we can add them to here rather than going through at the admin portal. And then this gives me the ability to standardize my license and feature deployments to Entra ID groups. So I might have a dev, test, and prod group that all have various iterations of the M365 E3 license, right? Where one has certain features enabled and one doesn't, and one has, like, you know, super cool whiz bangs built into it. But I can roll that out based on memberships in groups rather than having to try to control that at the admin.microsoft.com side. So in addition to groups and all their various guises, we also have access packages that bring together groups, SharePoint sites, teams, and applications to really deliver that role group experience that Active Directory promised us with global groups 20 years ago, right? Access packages offer users and IT departments flexibility over access management, including self-service requests with tracking and validation, separation of duties capabilities, which is super cool, automatic expiration, and access reviews. And you can even offer these packages to guest users in other organizations through B2B access. So the process begins by defining catalogs and their owners inside of the identity governance and entitlement management side of the Entra portal, and then delegating responsibility for those catalogs to SMEs or business unit IT, right? A lot of times we have been stuck trying to manage who all these things, what are all the resources your department's responsible for? I don't need to know it. You know it. You can add these resources in, right? As the catalog owner, you know what your department deals with. Not my problem. Catalog owners then can add all their resources to that catalog. And in this case, I have an IT catalog with apps, teams, sites, and groups. And some of these groups activate licenses, while some enable access control, and others have complex behaviors that do things like create and assign a Windows 365 cloud PC for the user. And then I, as the catalog owner, can create these access packages, which bring together access to any subset of those various resources, right? So maybe I had 15 SharePoint sites and 12 groups. I can put together an access package that has 3 of each, along with some application, and deliver that up to a user. If you need this access package to only be a site visitor to a particular SharePoint site, whereas another one is a member and another one is an owner, we can define those roles to those resources within the package as well. And then we can also hide them, right? So you can see in here, I have one called Break Glass. Now, this does not align to Microsoft's published best practices, but you can absolutely do this. You can create an access package that has your emergency administrative controls hiding inside of it, but you can then hide that package. So the only way to ever get it, even if you have the right access, resources and accesses, is to actually know the published URL of that. Security for obscurity, no, but okay. But you can do that, right? So you can package these things and hide them. So if I open the security analyst package, we can see that all the accesses that come along with it, along with the role rights that are granted to those resources. I can define my separation of duties as well by either adding existing access packages in entitlement management or intra groups. Such that if someone requests this package while holding the compliance officer package, they will be denied. Now, a lot of us are starting with groups, right? So these existing packages won't be there to be incompatible, but we can actually define that there are incompatible groups. So if you're in that, you're never going to be able to request this. And it simply just denies them when they attempt to request it. Pretty neat. So digging a little bit deeper into what exactly it means to request or gain access to a package. You'll see that right here for this particular one, there are 3 different policies that can assign or grant access to this package. The first is for external users. And in this, I can explicitly name an external partner organization that is able to request access. And access must then be approved by a named sponsor in that external org, or it will fall back to our internal Annemiek van Vleuten for her to do approvals. Access to the package, its resources and everything will automatically expire after 30 days. And there's a monthly access review being sent to yet another named user to ensure that this is working as expected. So there's no permission to creep. It's automatically going to expire. And if by whatever means it doesn't expire, say the user keeps asking for access to continue, there's going to be handed off to someone else to verify that this is all being handled appropriately. Nothing can slip through the cracks here. This is all being systematically handled. The user is not responsible for activating these accesses. They simply request, you approve, and it's done. So the second policy is an internal user self-service policy where the user actually browses to and requests access to a package and it expires after 1 day. And the third and final policy, kind of going back to our AD best practices, is one that automatically assigns this access package to any internal user whose job title equals security analyst. It doesn't require approval and it will automatically expire when the user's job title changes. So now I've got 3 different mechanisms to support 3 different types of users who all need the same access, but they need it at different times and for different reasons. So as the user, right, there's a lot of flexibility in what we can make available to whom, but as the user, I simply go to myaccess.microsoft.com. I'm presented with the list of the access packages that are available to me. I can see what all the resources are that are a part of that access package, and none of these permissions exist until I hit request and the access is approved. At that point, Entra itself, the actual Entra identity management solution, provisions these accesses directly at the resources, right? So if one of the things that I'm going to get is access to the Purview Admin Center, I am going to be programmatically added to the group that grants access to that admin center in real time. I don't have access to it right now. That permission doesn't exist. It will be added by Entra, and when my permissions expire, all of that will be rolled back. So it's actually really neat because when the user is calling in the middle of the night to say, why can't I get into this? I access my access package. They're not going to be able to bypass that global group and stick them in the local group because they should actually appear to already be in that local group if the package is actually activated. So it kind of obviates that whole problem of users getting stuffed into all kinds of groups all over the place. So users and admins can also track their requests, the revocations, the delivery status, all of that stuff over time. And actually, one of the most interesting things about access package management is that the logging for this goes back a year, whereas audit logs in Entra and almost everything else in the cloud goes back by default 30 and in some cases now 90 days as a result of changes over the summer. This goes back a year. So you can go back and look and see what you've requested, what your direct reports have requested, all that kind of fun stuff. You can track all that for up to a year. Now, all of that allows us, as I mentioned, to go from this process of managing users' access from AD with nested groups and all this craziness to just the user assigned to the role or to the access package. They activate it, and they are then added directly into having permissions to those specific resources. And again, this just gets away from that 3 o'clock in the morning support call, because if the request access gets approved, provisioned in real time, help desk can actually watch that happen live in the audit log because the add member to group happens right then and there as they're watching. So it's super duper cool. Really easy way to manage. And again, it automatically expires and users don't have to go back in and take things back out when it ends. All right. Whew, a lot of stuff there with group management. The next part of permissions creep is where we run into some of our worst challenges, and that's us. We're a little guilty of this, right? Privileges, once they are offered up, are very, very difficult to pull back, right? The other problem with privileged access in Active Directory is that it is assigned to groups, and groups can be nested. And I really, actually, truly have seen an organization with over 1,000 users with a not super complicated Active Directory forest with 2 domains and a root domain, where through nesting and through trusts, every user in the organization was an enterprise admin. Every single one of them. And that is actually more common than a lot of us realize. We can nest groups technically to an infinite level. However, a token will generally run out of space at about 2048 memberships, and it will simply fail. But that doesn't mean the access doesn't exist. And so you have to be very careful, and with Active Directory, it can be very challenging to track where all those nested capabilities go. The other problem that you get into with AD is that semi-annual audit, where you have to send an email out to every single person who holds a privileged role and say, do you still need this role? And the answer is universal. Of course, yes, I absolutely need this role that I haven't touched in the last 6 months to do my job. How dare you ask me that, right? Which leaves you as the bad guy, both to the auditor and to your staff, explaining why you need to pull permissions back, and to the auditor of why you can't, right? All of that puts you in a terrible, terrible position. And while there is support for a native just-in-time admin rights capability in AD, it is extremely burdensome from an administrative perspective. It requires investing in Microsoft Identity Management. It involves a bastion domain. It involves all kinds of stuff that if you don't need it, it's massive overkill. In Entra, we simply have privilege identity management, automated access reviews capabilities, and both privileged roles and protected actions. And I'm going to get into and show you kind of what all those things are and how they work. But so in Entra, right, our roles are not groups, they are roles. They are behaviors and permissions that are added to things that can be assigned to a group, but they are not groups themselves. So you can't accidentally nest yourself all the way to enterprise admin within Entra. Somebody has to manually have added a role originally. And originally it wasn't even addable to groups, it was just to users. So somebody had to be manually added to a role. With privileged identity management, we turn role assignments into time-bound assignments, right? So we can actually say, yes, I need to be a global admin, but I don't need to be right now. And if I am actually not holding the role right now, if it's not active right now, you can't even query my account to see that I could be one. It's not there. It's maintained within privileged identity management's knowledge, not within Entra identity's knowledge. So a little bit of a schism in terms of how that's presented and how it's held, but I can't query any account that's managed through privileged identity management and see what roles it's eligible to hold. I actually have to do that through privileged identity management natively. So what that allows me to do then is say that any role I want to hold, whether it's a printer technician or a security reader or an authentication administrator or global admin, whatever it is, I don't need to be that all the time. I only need to be that for about an hour a week. And when I do need that, I probably should have some extra security added in on top of the account that's requesting access to that. And so what I am able to do is convert my membership to that role to eligibility. I am now eligible to request that role, and I'm going to get reporting on who all is using their roles, whether or not I have accounts out there that do not have appropriate authentication requirements to access those roles, and whether or not roles are being assigned outside of privileged identity management, which is a pretty quick and easy way to see if users are trying to bypass your controls. So When these role elevations expire, they just go away. User doesn't even have to log out. The session doesn't have to be reset. Continuous access evaluation verifies that they do not continue to hold that role and they're able to keep going. So let's dig in and talk a little bit about what it looks like when we try to access a role. So I've got this custom role that I created in my organization called printer technician, right? And I'm able to define what a role request looks like, right? How long it's able to be active. If you request a printer tech, you're not having a great day, I'm going to let you hold that role for up to 8 hours, right? It's not going to require any special step-up authentication. I am going to require a justification, so you're going to put that in there, and that's going to be added into the audit log and trackable for any future admin to go back and look and see. But I'm also going to be able to decide whom to alert if somebody activates that role, right? If there are any permissions or approvals that need to be a part of it. But I can also decide that a user shouldn't be eligible to hold this role forever. So I've got a set of folks that I know, all right, we're going to do a whole global printer deployment, and then we're going to start that project on October 1, and we're going to term that project on December 31st. To do that, I'm going to bring in a staff of people. And I don't want to have to go back and remember in June of next year to take away this right from people to be able to request this. So not only am I going to time bound their ability to hold the role to 8 hours, but I'm going to time bound their ability to request the role from October 1 to December 31. After that, if I forget or I don't have a lifecycle workflow defined to terminate your account or whatever, and you're still on staff somehow and you still have an active account, at least you won't still be able to activate this role. And this is really powerful, right? We know with contracts and with bringing in contractors and subcontractors and all that kind of fun stuff, we know when their term dates are. We know when their contracts run. And it is super duper easy within all of these roles and all of their assignments to create assignments for specific users or even specific groups that are time bound to their employment time. So it's really, really easy to do here. I see a lot of organizations using privileged identity management, but I almost never actually see people time bounding the eligibility. It's there for anything that you can define privileged identity on. Absolutely take advantage of it because not everybody who needs to be a global admin needs to be able to be one forever. All right, so the other thing that we also get with this is that we also get these access reviews, right? So part of my semi-annual audit, right, is still sending out that query of who still needs to have access to this. And everybody then is going to come back and say, well, I still need it. But Entra access reviews can perform schedule reviews of groups, apps, access packages, privilege roles, and even guests with recommendations and automated actions of what to do based on their replies or what their account looks like at any given moment. So if you schedule a review of the global admin group or a global admin role, sorry, and 3 people who hold that role don't reply, Entra can simply remove their access. It doesn't even have to wait for you to approve anything. It can simply say at the end of the review period, those who have not replied, they're simply removed. And I don't have to be the bad guy anymore, right? I didn't take away your access. You didn't respond to the email. You decided this was frivolous, not me, right? So I'm out of the business of being the bad guy with access reviews. And the other thing that's really neat too is that at the end of any one of these access reviews, I can actually have the results sent to the auditor. So if you're going to be Johnny IT guy who tries to swagger and say, yeah, I still need global admin because once every 7 months I reset a user password, I don't have to have a conversation with you. You replied that to the auditor, right? And now they can be the bad guy and have that conversation with why that's an inappropriate control. So it really does take me out of the hot seat of having to try to, interpret auditing requirements to IT people. It's fantastic. It just makes it so much easier. The other thing it can do too is it can actually automatically remove guest membership. Like there is actually a built-in access role, or sorry, access review designed to look at guest users in your environment and say, if they have no more access, should they still be active? Why do you have an active guest account that has no access, right? So those are just built-in things that access reviews can do that, again, help limit that permissions creep over time. And then we also have introduced just in the last month, the Microsoft has added the ability to identify privileged roles and specifically privileged permissions that comprise those roles. So even if we are, sorry, let me read this little thing here, stated here. These roles and permissions can be used to delegate management of directory resources to other users, modify credentials, authentication or authorization policies, or access restricted data. Privileged role assignments can lead to elevation of privileges if not used in a secure and intended manner. So now we can identify, again, not just which roles, but also specifically the underpinnings of which permissions themselves create a privileged role. So if you go and create a new custom role, it will actually automatically be identified as privileged if you bring those permissions into it. So again, just another way to kind of identify where things may be getting ready to become a challenge for you as permissions increase. And then again, we have this difference between privileged permissions and protected actions that's also been recently introduced. So just about a month ago, August 15th, Microsoft introduced this concept of protected actions in Entra. And I've spent the whole session not talking about conditional access policies. And I've done that kind of on purpose because they're not really a part of your permissions program. They're really an access control portion of it. And we're really focused on permissions. But what we have introduced here is this ability now to start looking at behaviors, actions in Active Directory that can be changed or can represent changes to your Azure Active Entra. Man, new name changes that I'm still catching up with it. Can it actually recognize changes to your Entra ID and identify them and force the user to step up their authentication to an even higher control? So we can set the bar really good and high for users to be able to make changes to do things like bypassing your CA policies. And that's why I have to mention CA policies now, because we actually do this through conditional access policies and adding authentication context. And one of the most challenging scenarios I have seen for Entra and cloud-based organizations is when admins reach into conditional access policies and they try to add themselves as specific or explicit exclusions, because an exclusion always beats an inclusion. Well, now we can actually monitor the CA policy management and enforce a higher step up so that when somebody goes into your CA policies and tries to add themselves as an exclusion, we can see that, track that, and actually enforce that they go through a higher step up authentication to make sure that that action is either prevented or tracked at a very high level. So that brings us to the end of today's journey of digging through the permissions creep challenges that we had with traditional identity management solutions. As I mentioned, we have done a lot more of exhaustive explorations of many of the features and capabilities that are part of the Entra stack, and we absolutely are going to circle back and cover internet access and private access in upcoming events. But with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Christina for Q&A.
Hi. First of all, great job, Xavier. Thank you so much for that. I know there's a lot of content to cover in an hour. You must crush it. But okay, so jumping into Q&A. First question, will this work in Azure AD hybrid, or is that restricted if groups or users have to be modified on-prem?
So actually, that is one of my favorite use cases for dealing with things like access reviews. You saw my break glass account or group sitting in my Entra ID, and you know, one of my early demonstrations was I had actually an Active Directory synchronized to my Entra environment, right? So I had a hybrid environment, and what I wanted to do was monitor an on-premises group using the tools that are available in Entra. And so I simply added that group to an access review and set weekly reviews and send notifications whenever membership changes, and then started adding users to it on premises. And sure enough, I started getting my notifications. Now, at the time, I didn't have anything enabled for write back controls. So there was no ability to do anything with that other than take a piece of paper and go and say, no, you're a bad person, and execute the change back in Active Directory. But there is write back capability now. And so, yes, you can. I still think, though, that if you have a large Active Directory environment, you've probably got some additional controls that you might want to think about moving toward before you're going to be managing all of this in Entra. I did actually cover some of that in that RVA-sec discussion as well, too. If all of your apps are in the cloud, and you're just managing identity on premises, and your users really don't use their on-premises account for much of anything, like even the computer is managed in Entra or in Intune, you can actually set smart card required for interactive logon on the on-premises account, and that'll make it so that that account cannot be used for any on-prem systems, but it won't synchronize the daily password overwrite to Entra. So there's ways that you can do that while leveraging the controls of Entra to make sure that you get exactly what it is you're looking for.
Okay, awesome. And I did include, for everyone attending, the link to Adrian's RVA-sec presentation in the Q&A chat for your reference. But okay, next question. So can a customer use permissions management if they have other identities with access to their IaaS platform that aren't yet in Microsoft Entra ID?
So yes, and that's actually, so I mentioned that we covered the Entra platform kind of all up last year, and I explicitly didn't want to dig too deeply into third-party cloud management today. So there is a component of Entra that is Entra permissions management, specifically called that, and it really deals with Microsoft's CIEM solution, CIEM solution, and that is enabling and managing permissions across multi-cloud. So whether you're dealing with permissions in AWS or permissions in GCP or permissions in other systems, you can actually bring those permissions, and this is kind of thinking about like how we would do roles in Entra, but applying them into those other solutions. And again, we did cover that pretty deeply last year in our Entra webinar. So it would be very difficult for me to cover it sufficiently here, but go back and watch that.
I would say I will find that. I'll drop that link in a sec in this chat. But sure. Okay, so you recommended a semi-annual audit for IT Right. Would you recommend semi-annual, quarterly, or even annual? Is that okay?
I would recommend that you do what your insurance requires, what your auditors require, and then whatever helps you sleep well at night. So access reviews can go anywhere from, they might even go down to hourly, but they can go all the way up to yearly, right? So, you know, I would keep a good watchful eye on the things that I don't want changing. And I would also then make sure that I had separate access reviews defined to meet the needs of the legal needs of the organization. So I don't think that there's any really such thing as too much access reviewing. There definitely is such thing as too little.
Yeah. Okay. Can temporary access management be scheduled? For example, if I want a user to only have access to something the first week of every month.
So that is actually something I've heard asked pretty regularly, and that is not actually technically supported, right? So a user can request that their elevation be active immediately, or they can schedule it in the future, but they can only schedule it one time in the future. And so the theory there is, I know I'm going to need to support a user's got a help desk issue where I'm going to have to go and physically stand at their side, and they're only available at 3 p.m. There's no sense in me activating my role right now for 4 hours and potentially running out of time before I've addressed their concern. What I can do is schedule the activation for 3 p.m. so that when I get to their desk, I set up my PC, I've already got my admin rights granted and approved. I'm able to then work for 4 hours with them and make sure that anything that comes up is addressed. What you can't do, though, is schedule recurrence of that activation. And that has been a feature request, but I think part of the reason why you can't is if you schedule something on a weekly basis and then you're not available that week, your account becomes elevated whether you're there or not, right? So if it's an unmonitored account because you're on vacation and you're the chief poobah and somebody manages to compromise your credentials, then every Monday at 8 a.m. they just have admin, right? So there's pros and cons to the answer of no, you can't. But you can absolutely schedule your next elevation to be sometime in the future.
Okay. And then, all right, we got one more. And if anyone has any more questions, please feel free to drop them into the Q&A function of the teams. But last question I have right now is, I like this one. To be blunt, we're a large nonprofit with a small IT team. What's an easy and immediate next step to preventing permission creep, for example, MFA?
So there's actually a number of different ways to do that. The most common scenario we see of ensuring that everybody's using MFA is to enable a conditional access policy that simply says for your most critical apps, you ain't getting in if you're not using MFA, right? There are some bigger capabilities that have been recently introduced to help drive adoption of MFA, but the simplest is to simply create a CA policy that says, in order to get to this app, you must come in with MFA. And you can define absolutely what level of MFA you want for any given app you want too. So if you got one group of users that can only handle SMS, that's all they'll ever be able to do. It's a frontline application. Then you can set that as an authentication context acceptable for that frontline application, right? So you don't have to go all or nothing with Authenticator right now. You can support your users at whatever level of the MFA journey they're at.
Okay. Yeah, and to that user, and I guess this leads into my thank you ending speech, and Jason, I can hand it back to you in a second. But one, thank you everyone for attending today. But our YouTube channel has, Adrian, to your point, Microsoft Entra or conditional access. We've done webinar last year on Entra, conditional access. I know we've done several, and our YouTube channel has all of our previous webinar recordings, which I will include in the follow-up email with the recording to this webinar by tomorrow. But in the future, please be sure to keep up with us on social, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Like I said, I included the URL to the RBA SEC presentation in the Q&A chat, and check our events page for more upcoming webinars. I know on, I think, October 12th, one of our Power Platform solutions architects is doing a Copilot deep dive in Power Platform, which will be exciting. And but yeah, Jason, I will hand it over to you for any final thoughts.
Yes, well, I don't have a grand closure to this,
but just straight off.
But I think a few of the questions, in particular that last relating to, okay, what's like the lowest hanging fruit and how do I go about this?
Yeah.
And look, we've got such great experts at our disposal with the likes of Synergy Technical here. So at the top of the call, I know Adrian's contact information was listed there, but highly encourage a conversation. One of the things that I'm really appreciative of is their advisory capability to just make sure that our customers fully understand, what you've got your hands in, where you might have some potential gaps, and certainly with cost in mind, how you can really optimize your experience with a lot of these Microsoft products, that some of which you probably have and just might need to right size to your specific needs. So again, really appreciate the presentation, Adrian. Always a pleasure there, and to our friends on the call, thank you so much for everything you do. Certainly without you, Tech for Social Impact doesn't exist either. So with that, I suppose wrap it up, and Christina, you can close us out.